Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Steve Williamson, who is Director of Solution Consulting at BluJay Solutions. And today we're going to talk about taking a fresh look at compliance screening. Now, one of the few things, and there are only a few things, that are positive about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it's forced a lot of companies to reevaluate all aspects of their supply chain processes and capabilities. And one of those areas is compliance screening. What is compliance screening? Why has it become more important? And what capabilities should companies look for in a solution? Well, those are just some of the key questions we're going to address in today's episode. And it's great to welcome Steve back to the program to share his insights and perspective on this topic. So Steve, welcome to the program.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me back. Look forward to talking to you, catching up. It's been a little while.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the negative things about the COVID-19 pandemic is that, with all these conferences that have been canceled and so forth and turned virtually, you miss out on these opportunities to run into in person with old friends and colleagues in the industry. But congratulations, you're officially our first guest of 2021. So
fantastic.
I know you've been on for many, many years, over the years talking about different, topics. And certainly this is one that I think, certainly one of the reasons we're having this discussion today is one that perhaps might have been overlooked in the past, as I just said, but it's something that's become, certainly becoming more important. So let's just dive right into it. And for folks that may not be familiar with what compliance screening means, why don't we start there? I mean, what is compliance screening?
Great question. And it can be, like many things in the industry, it can be interpreted different ways. But for us, the way I kind of break it down, I break it down into first, it's a prevention method. It's all about making sure that, Mr. or Mrs. Customs don't come, knocking on your door, because at that point, you probably have done something. So it's really about making sure that they don't come and visit you. And really, it's around three areas that we look at. We look at it from who do you do business with from a party perspective? Are you working with companies or individuals that are not necessarily on someone's list? The other areas, of course, is embargoes. Those are a little bit more obvious, right? But it is something you need to think about. And the third area is, the item or the component that you're moving, does it have any type of license restrictions? Is there anything that, you should know about, or the government wants to regulate, let's say, the amount that is shipped into a particular country, or the value, et cetera, that may happen as you're trying to move those goods. So when you think about compliance for our discussion today, I kind of lump those three into a program that helps you make sure that you're doing the right things with the right people and following the right rules so you don't get that knock.
Right. And I like you broke it down into those different categories, because I think sometimes people might think, well, it's just making sure that you're not, shipping things to, countries that we shouldn't be dealing with. But, it goes beyond that, as you talked about it. Right now, it goes down to the product level, the item level, and not only countries, but individuals perhaps as well, too.
Absolutely.
That's part of this compliance, program. And I think one of the things that makes this even more complex is that this is not a static thing, right? It's constantly right. It's constantly changing, right? So you have to, stay on top of it. I mentioned, the pandemic, obviously, we're early on in 2021 here, but it's still having an impact on supply chains. I mean, how has the pandemic, elevated the importance of compliance screening? I mean, has it changed it in some ways?
Well, it has. The pandemic's changed a lot of things. Like I wore a collar shirt today for you, but besides those types of things, when you think about, again, what I had described a few minutes ago, and we think about your network, where are you sourcing goods from? Who are you shipping to? In the past, you had mentioned, I thought you had mentioned e-commerce, right? When you think about, the fact that, we're just buying differently, and I think that will continue even after the pandemic is lifted, we'll still have this buying and consuming more directly, which is breaking people out of the supply chain. And subsequently, the responsibility of where you are in that supply chain and where you're pushing things to now is maybe on you, and you didn't realize that. Or like I said earlier with the suppliers, if you're sourcing things from a particular country and you're having trouble with that, and now you're going to another country, well, how do you just know that those companies that you're doing business with are okay, to keep it simple? So that supply chain and the view of the supply chain is really what could have shifted potentially for people in regards to, again, responsibility of where you're doing business and how you're doing business.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I mean, and again, this is one of those areas where reevaluating makes sense, because one of the things that we've seen, obviously, as you talked about, is the surge in e-commerce, and in many cases it's companies doing e-commerce for the first time, or maybe doing direct to consumer shipping, when maybe they used to work with distributors or other third parties, where those entities were the ones that were primarily responsible for the compliance aspect of it. But now that they've taken ownership of doing the shipping directly themselves, now they find themselves in the situation where they have to take primary responsibility for this. I think the other aspect is that I think you mentioned it as well. One of the things that we're seeing right now is companies reevaluating their overall supply chain network, right? Where are they
Absolutely.
manufacturing products from? Where are they sourcing from? Where are they shipping, the to and from locations? And as those changes are being made, you have to take these things into consideration to make sure that, from a compliance standpoint, that you aren't going to, run into any kind of roadblocks or challenges, because you didn't take a look at that up front as you're making those network design changes. Absolutely. Or considerations. Which again leads me to my next question. I mean, ultimately, and you brought it up in your opening comment there as well, I mean, what risks do companies face if they don't have robust compliance screening capabilities?
We talked about prevention, to your point, right? But the other piece is it just could be delays, in your supply chain based upon what you're doing business with. There's the obvious things of fines, right? That's the fines and the penalties and the jail time, are absolutely things that can occur. Now, those are the extremes, right? You've got to really be doing some things bad in those particular cases. But the other thing, and it's not often talked about, but it does happen out there, is brand reputation in regards to just trying to be, in doing the right things. And I have been surprised over the years that the companies, and it's usually driven by an exec or someone within the organization that says, I just want to make sure I'm doing business, in a good way globally. And subsequently, something as simple as that brand protection and having a defendable compliance program. It goes way back when, but I won't mention the brand, but there was someone that was photoed with a particular jewelry item on. So subsequently, that company that makes that jewelry took a hit because that person was photoed with something that they had, because you can't prevent that ultimately. But they didn't have a defendable compliance program. So they couldn't, stand up and say, well, hold on now, I try to do the right thing, and these are the types of programs that I have in place. They didn't have anything. So subsequently, what they ship is not dual use. It can't be, used in a bad way. But they didn't really think about the fact of, hey, geez, I just want to be a good citizen and have that brand protection, that brand awareness of type of program in their mix, in their supply chain.
That's a great point, because I think that you're right. I mean, I think early on when I was covering, compliance as an industry analyst many years ago, the main focus of deterrent was these fines or penalties. And, and I'd always scratch my head, because, it's like, some of those could be pretty substantial, depending on how, bad the breakdown is. But it didn't seem to be much of a deterrent, because companies were still managing this with spreadsheets and so forth. But I think the smart companies were recognizing that, hey, you know what, those fines and so forth, even though they could be large, they're nothing compared to the financial impact of the brand, right? And damaging the brand image or the brand culture, brand reputation. And that's something that I think more and more sophisticated companies are becoming attuned to. And I think secondly, we talk about, I think one of the things right now with the pandemic that we've always talked about, but it certainly came to the spotlight again, is the fact that, being agile, responsive, speed is critical more than ever. And if you are falling short on the compliance side of things, where things are being held at customs or things are being held from shipments, shipments are being delayed as a result of a poor compliance program, that impacts customer service, that impacts the ability to, meet your commitments and so forth. So it really has broad implications beyond just, the fines and the penalties. And going back to the brand piece, it's one thing, you don't want to be in the front page of the Wall Street Journal, being highlighted as having fallen short on compliance. But in this day and age with social media and people kind of amplifying, any wrongdoing, if you will, I think it's even more, it's a bigger risk today than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
Where, again, you didn't have, folks that were retweeting and, sharing these stories and cases on a more, broad basis. So at the end of the day, I mean, does compliance, screening apply only to exports, or does it apply more broadly?
Well, if we think about compliance in general, and we've talked about a few examples of that, traditionally, as you've alluded to, some of the thought processes going back a few years has been around, it applies to an export, right? I'm moving something from a country to another country. That's true, of course. It does apply. And I mentioned licenses are required to go from one country to another country. But there's still the concept of making sure that you're doing business with the right people, you're hiring the right people. So if you think about, sending an email to a colleague, or sending an email to, someone in Iran, or sending an email, it's the same thing as an export. So colleges, that are, doing co-op programs where they're exchanging maybe, schematics of, plane engines, who knows, right, of what they're doing. They still have to think about these types of things, that it doesn't have to be a physical, doesn't have to be a big crate that's going on a plane or on a boat. It can be an electronic, but on top of that, what people also lose sometimes is a lot of the parties that are on some of the denied party lists are citizens of their own country. So, if I'm a manufacturer of arrows or, binoculars, you still have to think about shipping. You had mentioned, the amplification that happens in our society now, right? When an event, and not only how it's handled, in the news, but in social media and some of these other aspects. So subsequently, having that defendable compliance program to be able to say, no, I'm trying to do the right things, is becoming just as important as that penalty fine prevention. Because of things like that, is that, you have these transactions that I could be just shipping from California to Massachusetts, and now subsequently that person does something that they shouldn't have. And do I have a defendable way to say, no, I'm doing the best I can and stuff? Because, like I said, a lot of the denied parties, whether it's companies or people, are citizens of their own country, which is sometimes overlooked.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think it all boils down to, no system is 100% perfect all the time, right? I mean, there's particularly when you have, the human element in there. But I think you have to be able to show, some due diligence. You have to be able to show some good faith effort in having a compliance program in place, because, I didn't know, or hey, I've got these pieces of paper and spreadsheets, that's not going to really, put you in a good light in terms of showing that you put a good faith effort in, complying with the different regulations and rules that are out there. So we talked about, risk mitigation. I mean, what are the benefits, do you see companies having from having a robust compliance program in place?
The big one's the obvious, which we've talked about a couple of times, which is that, it's insurance. It's the ability for you to prevent the knock or to prevent the fine. And then you had mentioned and talked about the brand protection, the brand, making sure that you're trying to do the right things. And those are all, to me, it's always about just having a defendable compliance program. If you're shipping t-shirts, versus if you're shipping electronic components for, nuclear reactors, there's a difference there, right? Those are the obvious companies that, if I'm dual use, I ship civilian, but you're in that, I ship binoculars. I had mentioned those earlier, or maybe I'm an archery provider. You still have to think about, what happens there and who you're shipping to. Is it just domestic? Well, again, think about that. There's the listeners can go out there and look at, but the Bureau of BIS part of the government publishes literally a document that says, don't let this happen to you. It's a PDF and it's all about the fines and, the jail terms in some cases, but they publicize that because you don't want to be on that list, right? It's not good if my company name is in there, is part of that. But you can go and you can Google it and you can bring it up because they're trying to kind of get out there and make awareness that don't let this happen to you, right? Don't be this company, because maybe it's, like I said, something as simple as just having a compliance program like we're talking about. That's much better to have now than to be on that list in a year from now or 2 years from now.
Right. Well, it's always better to be proactive than be reactive, and be on the offense as opposed to be on the defensive when it comes to these types of things. I think the other aspect of it is, and again, this is something that I've seen, as an analyst, is, we always tend to think of all aspects of the supply chain in kind of these silos, but the reality is that everything in supply chain and it's all part of a system, right? And compliance really is part of the overall supply chain. It's part of the overall, logistics processes. And what happens or doesn't happen with compliance has an impact on transportation, has an impact on, other aspects of it. So, I mean, how do you see compliance screening fitting into the overall logistics landscape?
I mean, again, it goes back, a couple things pop out. What happens is you're as good as the information of when you did that initial compliance, right? So if you think about manufacturers that may have long delays, or not delays, a long time frame in between creating or accepting an order and actually shipping an order. So maybe it's a 2-month process to get, whatever manufacturer to get it sent. A lot can change. You had mentioned earlier about this is very much a changing environment. It's a compliance environment. So subsequently, we're updating content daily. So something that was okay yesterday doesn't necessarily dictate that it's okay today. So subsequently, when you think about logistics and transportation and that gap of time frame, that's really what tells you, do I have to be 2 or 3 checks? We think about the acronyms, the OMS, the TMS, right? The WMSs, all these acronym solutions that are out there. Well, you'll find compliance programs bolting into those because it's all about, well, when's the right time? Some companies may screen 3 or 4 times throughout a life cycle of just something as simple as an order. So that's always important for a company to weigh. That, there's always people, hopefully within an organization, that help them weigh their risk and be able to dictate to them, geez, we take an order and we ship it tomorrow. Well, yeah, I would agree, but if I'm again, I go to the extremes sometimes in my examples, but I am in that binoculars, or I have infrared devices that I provide. Well, if I've got 2 days or 3 days in between taking the order and when I'm ultimately fulfilling it, I might want to consider that compliance program multiple times in my supply chain, right? Some people think of it as just simply when I get the order. Well, you got to think about the rest of the time that goes on within there.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think, historically, I think a lot of companies have thought about just that front end, right? So, hey, an order comes in. Well, let's look who's the person ordering it, or the entity ordering, who's it being sent to, and so forth. And if it passes, okay. But as we talked about before, these things are very dynamic. These lists and the regulations are very dynamic. And depending on whatever changes might occur, whether with the regulations or otherwise, between the time you take the order and you're shipping it, particularly if you're talking about multiple days or maybe even a week or more, there could be changes there. And making sure that you have, that screening done multiple times is, critical there. And
Yeah,
again, it just
absolutely.
shows you that, this is the type of thing that you really have to think of it within the context of the overall end-to-end process flow, and identifying where compliance screening, fits into that whole overall workflow. And in many cases, as you noted, it's not just at one single data point or just one point in that process. It might be across multiple points in that process.
Well said, for sure.
So, Steve, just as a way to wrap up, when evaluating compliance screening, solutions and capabilities, I mean, what questions should companies ask to make sure that they're heading in the right direction?
Well, there's a few there that pop to mind. I mean, the first would be is the content. You had mentioned the content, right? And it's changing. There are providers out there in the marketplace that do provide the content themselves. And then there are providers in the marketplaces that resell other one's content. It's not to say one's better than the other, but you can appreciate one might be more timely than the other. So again, the sensitivity of what you're shipping, the type of shipping, you might want to make sure a provider has that content and has the robustness of the content. Because the other thing is global content. A lot of people look to the United States, and a lot of the list, if you look, there's some darn near 100, I think, lists that, as an example, we have in our compliance program. But you want to make sure you understand, where is that content in regards to the global aspect or reach of it. Because if you have, again, if you think about embargoes are much differently out of the US than they are out of Germany, right? We all have friends and frenemies that, we do business with out there. So making sure that you understand, can I support shipping from Germany, or can I support shipping from the United States? And what type of program do they have in place? And that really does impact those licenses that I talked about earlier. And the other ones, I had mentioned the acronym solutions, right? The OMS and the ERPs and the WMSs out there, TMSs. Can a provider hook into those? And I thought explained it extremely well when you described how it's important to kind of weigh when you hook in and how you hook into some of these. So can that provider kind of be able to manage that? Then the last one, this is sometimes overlooked, but you just want to make sure sometimes you can do those ad hocs with that provider. So we didn't talk about it, but visitors to your site. Again, I know when I have visited some of our customers out there that do have some sensitivity, you're providing your name ahead of time and your citizenship ahead of time. Why? Because they're screening you. And they're trying to make sure that visitors that visit their facility, or employees are sometimes overlooked, right? If you just want to make sure that you're doing business and checking them. So those are, you think about your network. I started at the beginning, and, sometimes people focus in on where I'm going, countries and people, but also you got to look at your own ecosystem, right? Internally around visitors, employees, suppliers, financial institutions that you're doing business with, because all is part of that ecosystem that is ultimately could bite you, right? If you're not trying to do the right things.
Yeah, a lot of great points. And I think, the first point there, I think is important. I mean, sometimes, we tend to think, when we think about solutions, we tend to think about software and, in some cases hardware as well, but software. But, this is an area where obviously software plays a key role. But, one of the aspects of it is that content that you talked about, right? And how do you get that data and that information? How do you digitize it? How do you make it available to the software that then works with the, creating the workflow? So, content, is a key, component of this, and kind of thinking through that and understanding, where does the content come from? How is it managed? How global is it, and so forth. I think that's the other piece that you brought up that I think was interesting. Obviously, we're here in the US, so it's easy to be kind of very US centric and think about imports and exports from the US, but you might be a global operation, and you need to be thinking about compliance from a very global multinational standpoint. Right now, obviously one of the big stories heading into 2021 was Brexit, right? And
perfectly, yeah, exactly.
So now you've got perhaps some new rules and regulations concerning imports and exports from the UK to other parts of the EU. But understanding what those compliance requirements might be moving forward, and having that codified and having that content managed is going to be important as well.
Absolutely.
Well, Steve, I think we covered a lot of ground on this topic, today, as always. Appreciate your insights and advice on this topic. And certainly it's one of those areas that, again, might have been overlooked in the past, but I think it's one of those areas that if companies don't have it on their to-do list to kind of take a look at their compliance screening capabilities and processes, they should, in the weeks and months to come, because it's
at least think about it once.
Absolutely. Well, Steve, again, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
I appreciate it. Stay safe. I appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the BluJay website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Steve, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.